Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Unfiltered Author Talks with Alex Rossino this time. We're really excited to have you on here. I really enjoyed reading this, so I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about that tonight.
Thanks,
First
Tyler.
off, how are you doing? And you want to introduce yourself?
I'm well. Yeah, thanks very much for having me.
Yeah.
As Tyler said, my name is Alex Rossino. I'm a historian, live in Western Maryland. That's my nighttime job. I have a day job too. I'm also an analyst for government contractors. So
Ooh, okay.
I need to make a living somehow.
Yeah,
It's
no
only
kidding.
one way to do it.
I was a government contractor for a few years myself, actually.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was
a lot of people
pretty
in this
fun.
area, especially, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was on Capitol Hill for roughly 3 years.
Oh, okay.
Doing
Yeah.
we were legislative correspondences, if you will. But
Yeah.
it was
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah.
Good.
So first, I want to talk about one of the first books I read by you, which was 6 Days in September.
Yeah. Sure.
Fantastic read, and that
Thanks.
I really like. I'm not a big novel guy, so one thing is I don't really go to pick up a novel, but I'm really interested in the Maryland campaign of 1862. So of course that was one that kind of struck. I'm like, I'm going to give this one a read, and
Sure.
absolutely loved it, man. So I wanted to thank you for writing that number one and just adding to the Civil War literature there. That was really cool to see.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was a real experience for me too. When I decided to start writing it, I approached it too much like a historian,
Mhm.
and wrote 4 chapters of it, and went, "This isn't a novel." And so I threw out what I had, and started over again.
Wow.
And it took me a long time, especially to get used to writing dialogue. It's a very
Mhm.
different process from writing up, sources, historical sources,
Sure.
and things like that. So, but one thing I will say is that if any historian out there is listening, I would recommend that you try and write at least a short story, because it
Hmm.
really helped my writing. I thought. I didn't think I was a
Okay.
bad writer to begin with, but it really helped once I had learned how to write as a novelist. And telling a story, my writing just like leapt to a entirely different level.
Okay.
So I would highly recommend it for anyone who's thinking about even writing history. Just try writing a short story or just a few paragraphs, and just see how different it is to try and write
Mhm.
from the inside out, as opposed to from the outside in. Right?
Yeah. No kidding. Well, yeah, like I said, it was a fun read too. That was something I love about the novels when I do pick them up is either they're going to be really good or this is one that I put down. It was not a put down. It was just I kept reading and reading. I think it took me all of the day to read it because I was just
Thanks.
sitting on the couch. Yeah, man.
Yeah, I wrote it that way on purpose, actually. It was written all in with a sense of immediacy so that
Hmm.
you would want to turn the page. But not only that, so that you wouldn't actually know, if you only knew what the characters and personalities knew at the time, you wouldn't actually know what's coming next,
Right.
even if you knew the history of the campaign and the battle.
Sure. Nah, but it was awesome, man. And that's, I was really excited to see that you were doing There, Maryland. I remember when that first came out, and I was like, oh man, I have to have a copy of this. Like, this is going to be incredible. I have a few ancestors that served on both sides actually during the Antietam campaign, and one of them was with Parker's Virginia Battery, which I'm sure you might be familiar with, right up
Mhm.
in front of the Dunker Church. So it
Yep.
means a lot to be able to read about their experience as well. I know a lot about what the sharpshooters, Berdan sharpshooters, they
Mhm. Mhm.
some of my relatives there were there as well, and I had a little bit of experience with that, but the knowledge on a lot of Duffy, who is my ancestor with Parker's Battery, was just slim to none. I didn't know a lot about it other than what he left in his diary and what some of the other members of Parker's Battery had to say about it. So I was able to approach it that way, and that's one thing. Not to mention the Special Orders 191 piece you have in here, which I really want to get in and talk to you about and have you
Sure.
just,
Yeah. Please, let's go.
so, first thing I would like to do in these unfiltered talks is really like talk about the writing experience with this book and what led you to write There, Maryland, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So as I explained really in the introduction, I found over the years that I was talking to people about 6 Days in September that there are a lot of people who like history and there are a lot of people who like novels, and there are a few people who like both. So there are a lot of people who they will not read novels, no matter how well sourced they are, no matter how close to the truth they are, no matter any of that. They won't read
Mhm.
any of that stuff. But there are some people who they just won't read history because they don't like footnotes, they don't like explanations. They want to get into the story and they want it to, capture them, and they want to experience what happened as opposed to know about what happened.
Mhm.
So, over the course of many, many years, I had collected hundreds of sources, and over that period, hundreds of pages of notes from those sources. And I was putting together these essays here and there. Just about specific issues and specific subjects, and kind of like the one that's in the book on the photograph, the photograph of Confederate troops in the city in the streets of Frederick.
Mhm.
And I realized that I had enough material to put together a 7-chapter book if Ted Savas was interested in actually publishing a book of essays.
Mhm.
And so I thought, well, let me pitch it to him and see what he thinks. And he thought it was a great idea, especially because he likes 6 Days of September so much, and took a big
Right.
chance on me, actually, because it's the only novel he's ever published. Um,
Hmm.
and he doesn't have any plans to publish anymore except for Guns of September, which is the sequel to 6 Days in September. That's the federal side.
I'm
That's
excited
been
for
done
that.
since 2019, actually.
Mhm.
It's a COVID casualty.
Oh man,
Um,
I remember seeing something about that. I'm anticipating that one as
it's
well.
still up on their webpage. I mean, I have a
Yeah.
landing page and the cover's done, and we have all of the blurbs, and a third of it is edited, and everything's finished except for the last two, like 27 chapters out of about 16 chapters need to be edited still.
Okay.
Um, but anyway, so I had all this material, and I thought, well, why not put this out there? Because it was just sitting around, and I had a lot of ideas too. Because as I was doing the research, especially the research to try and understand where Lee was, like so
Mhm.
during Antietam. So the last two chapters, 6 and 7, are those two essays. Those are material that's directly taken from what I used for 6 Days in September.
Awesome.
That's why it's so detailed where Lee
Mhm.
was when, because I needed to know that stuff in order to write, the history or write the story of Lee's experiences during the Battle of Antietam.
Sure.
And so I, realized over the years that I was coming up with different understanding of the campaign than I had seen and written anywhere. I saw some things in the historiography that were, um, let's put it this way, questionable. So I decided I wanted to write something that sort of corrected the record while I still had while I had the material.
Mhm. Awesome. And I found so many aspects of this book really interesting. Again, I mentioned the Special Orders 191, but even how it
Yeah.
starts, it's one of those draw you in books. Is you start with the Maryland song, the Maryland, My Maryland, which
Yeah.
we all know the Army gets to the banks of the Potomac, and that's pretty much what's sung universally in the Confederacy there when they're moving
Mhm.
across. So that was a really cool way to start. Another thing I really liked was the analysis on the photo of Frederick.
Yeah.
Was that? I mean, that's a controversial thing in itself to talk about. I know a lot of people have differing opinions on where the photo was at and what time was it, 64 or was it 62? And I think
Sure.
you touched on that very well. And what led you to want to kind of weigh in on that, if you don't mind?
Well, you know, I asked the authors to send me of that article, battlefield photographer article, to
Mm,
send me a copy of it because I don't subscribe to battlefield photographer, and I was curious to see what it was that they were, where they got their information and
sure.
what the claims were that were really in it. And the claims about 1864 are far more hesitant, and they're more like a suggestion that it may be 1864
Hmm.
as opposed to 1862, in their article. Whereas the Washington Post, the article that came out about that, it said categorically this is July 1864 and not 1862. So I'm like, it
Mm,
didn't pass the sniff test for me.
right.
So I looked and dug back through their sources, and I realized that they didn't have any sources that said it was 1864. And then I went, well, what's the evidence? What's the evidence that's available to show whether or not this photograph really is 1862 or 1864? Given the
Hmm.
fact that we don't know who took it, we don't
Right.
know what day it was taken. Really, I mean, we don't know. We know where it was taken, thanks to the work that they did. They did some great detective work.
So they did find where exactly that photo was taken.
Absolutely.
Oh,
It
that's
was
awesome.
found in North, it was right on North Market Street, about, I don't know, about 100 feet up, 120 feet from the intersection of East West Patrick Street and
Okay.
then Market Street. So right smack in the center of town.
Wow.
And that's really all we know about it. Really, was where it was taken. And so I decided to take a look through the evidence and see what it said and what I found. And then another thing, to kind of go back to my past history, I
Mhm.
was a historian in the photo archive of the Holocaust Museum for 4 years. So
Oh,
I
no
spent 4 years
kidding.
analyzing photographs and also putting them in context. So I would develop historical studies, short historical studies that would put the photograph in context, so that people who came to visit would look at a photograph and say, okay, well, this is what we know about it. This is where it took place. These things. So
That's awesome.
I tried to follow the same approach for this photograph, and to try and discern what I could of it. And what I found is that the documentary evidence actually shows that there was a column, Jackson's column, part of
Mhm.
Jackson's column, halted on the street in the middle of Frederick, coming down from the north. So it's John R. Jones' division, the old Stonewall division,
Mhm.
and that they were there waiting for several hours on the morning of September 10th. So what the photograph actually showed was the photograph was actually evidence that proved the documents, not the documents proved the photograph.
That's actually
And
really
so,
good.
and then I looked into the 64 evidence too, and I found absolutely no evidence for any claim that they made whatsoever. No solid evidence. Everything is conjecture. And then for the next 2 years, I went back and forth with one of the authors, Paul Bolchik,
Mhm.
via email. Went back and forth with him about this, and he kept on sending me lists of why it was 64, why it was 64. And I was like, well, if you thought it was 64, why didn't you argue it was 64 in your article? Because the article, like I said, doesn't really say that it's 64. It says it might be 64.
Sure.
Um, and then I said, well, can you prove it? Can you give me some proof? I want to see the beef, And I didn't. He doesn't have anything. It's literally simply conjecture from
Mhm.
start to finish. So until they prove something, until they have something else that really shows that it specifically can be 1864. It's 1862 to me.
Okay. Well, and I sort of have that feeling too myself, especially after reading what you wrote. But I didn't really see it being 64. And one of the things and again, this is a very rookie analysis, but I was looking at the way their uniforms were in comparison to the reports of what we have in 64.
Sure.
You know what I mean? And I'm looking at it as starkly different. And it would be Jubal Early's men that are supposedly photographed in 64, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
Yeah. Who were also part of Jackson's command in 1862.
That's right. So it theoretically could have been some of the same boys that were in that picture there.
Yeah,
But
theoretically.
and that's what I was looking at, just the differences in clothing that I've seen in other pictures from 64 of soldiers, the few and far that are there. Now, of course, it's hard to do that with a lot of the Petersburg pictures being taken too, in some of the prisoners that are in Belle Plaine. If you're familiar with that there's a big picture that came out in, I believe it was late '64, that was taken of prisoners that were on the way up to Washington that were taken right around the battles of Spotsylvania and Wilderness
Mhm,
in early '64.
mhm,
So a lot of these guys are still equipped with all of their uniforms minus their rifles, and
mhm.
they just looked starkly different than what is in the picture taken by the dry goods store.
Sure, sure.
So that was sort of what I just like. Okay, my only little analysis there was just I kind of went by the uniforms. I'm like, is this something that they would have worn in '64? Are these accoutrements something they would have had on their bodies in '64,
Sure,
or
well,
is
the
this
condition of them
'62?
too,
Yeah,
you know? There's no holes in anybody's trousers, they all have brand new hats on, they look like they're in really good shape,
right.
and that I've been able to find that, Confederate troops either, officers, quartermasters either requisitioned what they needed in Frederick or, there were some, supplies that did make it to the Army of Northern Virginia in Frederick
Hmm.
from Virginia, and then others where men just went and bought what they could on their own.
Wow.
So there's plenty of reasons why they would look as good as they do. You know, whereas in
Yeah.
1864, I would argue they're probably in as bad a shape as they were when they got to Frederick in 1862.
Yeah, and that's we're considering different battles like all the Overland campaign things happening, then the Shenandoah, the hard marching going through the Shenandoah and all of that. That
Mhm.
that is going to take a toll on your uniform itself too,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
you're going to look
Absolutely.
very ragged. So I know I agree with you on that. I think that was really well done, and I'm again one of the appreciative parts of this book. Not the whole thing's appreciative, of course, but
Yeah, sure.
that was really really cool to read, and I think I'm glad somebody touched on that because
Thanks.
again, it's a controversial thing, and we have a WAPO article, and I haven't read the photo. What is it? The Civil War photography? Are they the ones that
Yeah,
did that, or
battlefield photographer.
battlefield photographer?
Yeah, it's from the November 19 or 2018 issue.
Okay, I'm gonna have to look into that because I'd like to see that as well. That would be interesting to see. So, do you have a favorite story from writing this book? Did anything Because I know it was written during COVID, if I'm not mistaken, or was it before?
No, it was written during COVID, yeah,
During.
pretty much. And there was some pieces that I needed to research still, like little holes and questions that I had and stuff.
Hmm.
Because sometimes you'll pull a thread and you'll be like, it'll end, and you'll think, oh, well, there's got to be more here. I got to
Sure.
find out. But archives were closed.
Yep.
So for example, I didn't get to use very much Carmen material. Even though I
Oh
live
man.
only 75 miles from Washington, D.C., I never got a chance to get down there because our national archives were closed.
Hmm.
So I used what I could, and thanks to Tom Clemens also for providing me with a really detailed index of what's in the Karma materials. And there's
Oh.
some notes that he has on certain things that certain sources say, which was very helpful for certain questions and
Hmm.
stuff like that. But yeah, my favorite story actually is the story told by Alexander Hunter when he goes to Frederick on the 6th to have supper
Hmm.
at the house of the Reverend Dr. John Ross, who he knew from before the war. And he walks in the door, and who's there? He walks in the door. The woman of the house greets him and things like that. And who shows up a few minutes later? But Robert E. Lee and his staff, all dressed in their finest uniforms, and they're all clean and toileted, and probably some of them have perfume and things like that. And here he is, he's ragged, and his trousers have holes, and they're stained,
Hmm.
dirty. And the woman in the house tells him he tries to, as he says, I tried to escape, and the woman in the house collared him and sat her down right next to him or her and said, you stay here and you're going to eat with us. So he ate dinner with Robert E. Lee and with
Wow.
everyone else. So it's kind of it's really funny, I
That
think.
is. It is hilarious. He's trying to escape, and you have the woman of the house holding you hostage,
Yep.
not anybody from the army. That's so. Are you have you always been from Maryland? Is that something that really created an
No,
interest?
no, I'm a
No.
transplant. No, no, no. I lived in, let's see, before I married a woman from Sharpsburg. In
Awesome.
2011. We met in 2009, but I married her in 2011, and
Okay.
we came back here in 2013 to be closer to her family.
Okay.
But before that, I lived in Northern Virginia for 20 years. I lived in Arlington for 10. I lived in Reston for 10, or that area, Reston, that
Yeah.
kind of outer suburbs for 10 years. And then before that, when I was in graduate school at Syracuse University, I lived in upstate New York, which is where I was raised. I'm not born there,
Okay.
but I was raised there. And then before that, was in Buffalo at college, and
Oh, nice.
so, but I'm actually a born and raised New Yorker. My family, I've done some genealogy research, and practically everybody's from New York City. I mean, way back, like the 1840s. I mean, they're
Wow.
so far back that I can't even get grandfathered in for Irish citizenship. Because Rossino is my last name, but Italian is the smallest, kind of the smallest ethnic percentage that I have. Most of it's Irish,
Well,
uh,
that's likewise. I have a
German.
little bit of Italian, but Irish just overwhelmingly so
Yeah,
in
but
my
you've got a
family.
McGraw, so you sound like an Irishman. But
Yeah.
Rossino, I don't sound like an Irishman, but I don't
Nope.
look like an Italian.
I don't know what I'm confused with. Some days I look Italian without the beard. It's absolute Irish. So I'm like, I'm just gonna keep. But it's funny too because my mother's maiden last name is Churicella,
Oh, okay.
which is super Italian. I mean,
Yeah,
like you get
yeah, right.
super Irish McGraw and super Irish there with the Churicella. So the
Good old
McGraw thing,
Americans.
I found out last year that I come from a family of New Yorkers. I
Oh, no
didn't know
kidding.
that. Yeah,
Mhm.
Albany, New York.
Oh, okay, upstate
Hmm.
too.
Yep. So and this is gonna be interesting to even every time I tell somebody this, like, you have a great grandfather that fought in the Civil War. I am 26 years old with a great grandfather who served in the first United States sharpshooters.
Huh,
Yeah.
great
So my
grandfather.
dad,
Just
a
a great
great,
grandfather.
not
Yeah,
a great,
okay.
great, a
Yeah, it's
great.
interesting.
So my dad was a little bit older when he passed in January of 2010. He was 61 then. All right. He would have been significantly older now, of course, but
Mhm.
he had a grandfather who moved down to Washington D.C. after the war, and he gets it really bad in the war. He gets, I call it double dysentery on with a
Oh,
touch
okay.
of scarlet fever, and
Yep.
then hypothermia at Fredericksburg.
Oh boy.
So he goes to get his pension because he has dysentery pretty much the rest of his life and chronic diarrhea, so he can't work anymore.
Mhm, mhm.
And the government's pretty much like, dude, you're lying. Go home. I'm like, this guy can't even work because he's like using the bathroom 24/7, and you're just like,
Right.
yeah, we don't care. I'm like, what a storm that was for his wife. His wife ended up finally securing a pension post death from him, but they
Mhm.
moved to DC and they relocated. So you are familiar with Colonial Beach, Virginia?
Yeah, yep,
Yeah.
sure.
So they
Mhm.
relocated to Colonial Beach, Virginia, and
Okay.
that house that was purchased by them actually was torn down the year of my birth, which is really sad to make way for the new house that we lived in. And
Mm.
it was a hard thing for the family to lose. I never had obviously any recollections of it, but it's a cool little story to know that and then, he had a brother that served. So my great uncle was also in the first United States Sharpshooters Company B out of Albany, New York. And
Yeah.
they all come down here simultaneously after the war, which is pretty cool. So I got some New Yorkers there, and the other are Irish from Virginia, dating back to John Duffy, who laid a cornerstone of the Capitol with George Washington when they were doing
Oh,
that. He
okay.
actually made the silver trowel that Washington used. And so he was here in Fredericksburg, which made me
Wow.
like, wow, I'm back in Fredericksburg.
Yeah.
I've
Small.
so the Northern Virginia aspect too. I'm from Leesburg, actually. So that's,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
yeah, real close. Which also is kind of why I like to get into Southern Maryland campaign of 1862 as
Yeah,
well,
sure.
because right there is, I believe it's Edwards Ferry. Isn't there a significant crossing point somewhere outside of Leesburg when they're going north to Antietam? If I'm not
Well,
mistaken.
several of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Stuart's cavalry crosses in 2 points. One's at Conrad's Ferry, which later
Okay.
becomes White's Ferry.
Hmm.
Elijah Veers White, he buys it after the war, or 1865 or something like
Hmm.
that. It's like right after the war, and renames it White's Ferry. Then, of course, Edward's Ferry, which is where Fitzhugh Lee's brigade crosses. Wade Hampton's crosses at Conrad's Ferry, and Stuart's headquarters group crosses at Conrad's Ferry too.
Okay.
And of course, White's Ford, which is a huge, very obscure place that was picked probably for that reason, knowing the way Jackson operated. Um, and then some other troops crossed at Cheeks Ford and at Nolan's Ferry too.
Okay.
Notably, D.H. Hill's the first men across from the Third Alabama crossed at Nolan's Ferry, and then later I found some information, which is something new that I hadn't known, that the Army of Northern Virginia threw a pontoon bridge across the river there at Nolan's Ferry, and so
Really?
that's the two. I found a couple sources that said that, and also one very famous drawing. So if you know the real famous drawing by Thomas Nast, which shows the kind of scarecrow-looking, scary-looking Confederate horseman coming out of the river. His horse is dripping wet, and behind him, there's you can see Confederates coming across the river in this kind of ominous looking wave. And if you look in the distance, you can see a pontoon bridge with artillery crossing it.
Oh
And
wow.
so
I'm gonna have to go back and look at that painting then. Yeah.
I'm sure that it's in the book. I can't remember what page it is, but it's in the book.
I'm gonna have to flip through that real quick.
If you look in the illustrations, and
Yeah.
it um, the painting is obvious, or the drawing by Thomas Ness is obviously based on reports that he had received, or he had read about the campaign at the time.
Yeah, see Alfred Wode's picture there. I'm just looking real quick. Sorry about that, but now you have me extremely intrigued to go back and look. So I think I just didn't even pay attention. I should have glanced at that even further. But
Well,
that's a new aspect.
one of the
Yep.
appendices in the book is actually analysis of all those images. Again, going kind of harkening back to my background as a photo historian.
And that must have been a really interesting job to be a photo historian as well. Like, I mean, that
It was.
the different pictures you probably come across, and you said it was the Holocaust Museum you started with, correct?
Mhm, mhm.
That must have been a heavy, very heavy
Yeah, you'll
study
notice
there.
I'm not in that field anymore.
Yeah, no, I don't doubt
It's too
that.
much to take. You can't. I think it's is it Friedrich Nietzsche who said that if you stare into the abyss too long, the abyss stares back, and it stared back at me in hard in 2001, 2002, and I just couldn't take it anymore. So, especially
Understood.
because I was studying perpetrators, I wasn't studying victims. I was studying the guys who
Ooh,
were doing the shooting at the sides of the pits, and those guys. I wasn't doing the people who were being killed, because was kind of fascinated by mass psychosis, I guess.
yeah, that's a great word for a great descriptor. Absolutely. So, with another question that I had, and I think maybe you can touch on this a little more too, is
Sure.
the when Lee has his army in Maryland,
Mhm.
it's sort of this we're respecting everybody's property. I mean, we know it gets pillaged, or sometimes you can lose your articles. If you have an army that large, there, not every single person's going
Yeah,
to
there
obey.
are outliers, right?
Of
Mhm.
course. How did the citizens really react to getting handed Confederate script?
So it really depended. There were some who were outright unionists, and they simply just wouldn't take it, and they weren't uh, forced to take it or anything. It wasn't like there were Confederate officers standing there with swords and pistols, pointing at them, saying you have to take this or
Right.
not. But then there were a decent number of other people who were sympathizers or sympathetic to the Confederacy, and they wanted to help the Army of Northern Virginia, and so they did take it. And so I would say that the reports probably are about 50-50 when it comes
Huh.
to those who said we did great, being people would take our money and we were able to buy wherever we wanted, and then there were those who complained about the fact that they wouldn't take money.
Yeah.
And so over time, this is one of the things that I found that was really out of balance or out of whack with the campaign histories, is that too many people decided that they're simply going to use unionist sources, and so they paint the picture as if it's entirely unionist. There's no sympathy for the Southern Army except for maybe a few people, and so no one took their money, but they
Yeah.
did take, some did take it. The problem is that most of Lee's army doesn't arrive until this. They keep coming in, by the way. So Jackson's command, which there's no corps this time, remember,
Hmm.
Jackson's command arrives on the 6th of September. And then Longstreet's command arrives on the 7th of September, and Longstreet's men and others continue to kind of roll in until the 9th, actually, until the day that the day before the army moves out again. So, and these are a lot of people who are stragglers that are coming in because they made it slowly across the river. They may have stayed in Leesburg for a certain reason, all variety of all sorts of reasons and things like that. So, most of them and come in at a time when Jackson's men get there, and this is a city of 8,000 people at the time, so a large town really today.
Yeah.
It's a city then, and Jackson's men immediately quadruple the number of people in the area. And so they eat and buy or steal everything that they
Hmm.
nailed down. And by the time Longstreet's men get there, half the stores are probably closed already. There's no money to, or there's nobody who will, no, all the Confederate, pro-Confederate shopkeepers, they've already sold out all their goods, so they don't have anything left to sell. So they shut their doors. And so it looks like, to those who come later, it looks like, well, these people are, as one put it, cross-joined and mean, and that they're not going to support them at all, and so they can't get anything, and so they complain, and so that kind of carries on into the letters too, but out of context, because
Mhm.
Jackson's men, they show up on a Saturday. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, everything's closed, or things start to close up. Sunday, practically everything's closed again because
Yeah.
it's the Sabbath, right? And then Monday, that's when everybody really kind of piles into town, and there's nothing left to buy. So,
Mm.
or very little
Just
left to buy.
stripped clean.
Yeah,
Yeah.
pretty much.
That
It's
must
one
have
of
been
the
tough.
reasons Lee had to move his army, actually, is because there's
Mm.
nothing left in the area. If they had stayed there 2 more days, everybody would have been starving. Not just them, it would have been the locals too.
Right. And I think Lee didn't necessarily want to have that situation happening, of course.
No,
Yeah.
absolutely not. No.
Interesting. So another, and I hate the what if sometimes, but it's always fun to talk a little bit
Yeah,
about it.
sure.
So I think you probably know where I'm going with this. So the recognition of the Confederacy, I know that that plays sort of a big part in this invasion here by a foreign country, specifically England, or hell, even France. I've heard tell that France was even kind of on the radar as well.
Yeah.
Do you find a lot of validity to that? Did you find a lot of reasons to support that? Lee really did try to go and make this recognition, maybe even so Jefferson Davis prompting Lee to do that,
Oh,
or was it really more for a strike at the Union that you're hitting North? That's definitely going to impact the morale of the entire country.
so before I make a comment, how about I ask
Yeah,
you a question?
sure,
Socratic
absolutely.
method, right?
I like
How
it.
many times did you see me mention Europe in this book?
Mm,
Not at all, right?
no, I'm gonna say that's why I was like, I need to ask.
So there's no evidence at all that Lee took that into consideration. If he talked about it with Jefferson Davis, or read about it in Confederate newspapers, or spoke about it with Secretary Randolph or Alexander
Mhm.
Stephens, or any of these other, big Confederate bigwigs before he left Richmond at the beginning of the summer. Uh, okay, maybe he had some notion of it or knowledge of it, but there is no indication, at least in the evidence that I've seen, that Lee took it into consideration at all. So now the comment, the goal of the Maryland campaign was Maryland. It was not to influence northern elections, even
Right.
though that comes up in one of Lee's memos to Jefferson Davis. It wasn't to necessarily to turn the flank of northern defenses in Washington or anything like that, although those are all considerations and things like that. The goal of the campaign is to bring
Right.
Maryland into the Confederacy.
Yeah.
And that's something that others will argue, I'm sure, that I'm wrong about it. But the one thing that I've noticed is that if you look at Lee's comments and writings from the beginning of the campaign until after the war, there's one consistent theme, and that theme is that he had hoped to bring Maryland into the Confederacy. Other
Sure.
things were practical considerations to feed his men. So after the war, he says, "I entered Maryland to feed my army," which is true,
Yeah. Lots
obviously.
of green corn in Maryland.
But you don't, yeah, lots of it.
Yeah.
But you don't win a war feeding your army, right?
Mm-mm.
You feed your army in order to win the war, but doing the feeding itself doesn't exactly
Right.
win the war. So, he enters with a political objective, finds out quickly that he can't meet the political objective because Maryland is too tightly tied, as he puts it in a dispatch to or letter to Jefferson Davis, because the state shares a long line with Pennsylvania, so it's vulnerable to invasion from the north at any point along that line. There are tens of thousands of troops in Baltimore. There are tens and thousands of troops around Washington D.C. The real sympathetic part of the state to the Confederate cause is Baltimore to the east. So
Hmm.
the eastern shore, that's all cut off. So Lee quickly finds that in order to accomplish a political objective, he needs to accomplish a military objective, and that is to bring the Army of the Potomac to a conflict again, or a clash, um, either in Pennsylvania if Marylanders decide to rise up,
Hmm.
Or if they decide they're not going to rise up, and there's no indication of any kind of popular uprising, that they will then have to, the fight will then have to take place in Maryland in order to prove to Marylanders that the Army of Northern Virginia is willing to shed blood for them, and in order to liberate them from the clutches of the Lincoln administration, or from
Sure.
martial law and occupation. And that's actually one of the reasons why you use the term invasion when you first were talking about this.
Mhm.
And you'll notice that I don't use the term invasion in the book either. The
Right.
reason being is that at the time, Maryland is a contested state. It's also a state under martial law. The writ of habeas corpus has been suspended.
Yep.
Politicians have been arrested. Other people have been arrested. And there are a lot of people, especially Southern sympathizers, which is a large portion of the state. I wouldn't say that
Sure.
it's a majority in the state. I'd say maybe
Mhm.
35 to 40% of the people in Maryland.
Yeah,
It's
it's still
still
significantly large though. Yeah, like
sizable proportion. Um, considered Maryland to be a contested state, and a state that hadn't been allowed to make its own decisions, because remember, at the time the importance was state sovereignty, right?
mhm.
So every state should have the right to make its own decisions about whether it stays in the union or it doesn't, according to Southerners,
Yeah.
and in the Confederacy. And so they haven't had a chance to make up their mind. They were never given the opportunity to make up their mind. So Lee says, well, we're going to give them, he says it to Davis, we're going to give this a chance, in order to, or we're going to give them an opportunity to make the decision if they want to come or not. But when sympathizers in Frederick tell him at that dinner that Alexander Hunter is at,
Mhm.
tell him that they don't know why the Confederate Army is there, and they tell him that he can't that Marylanders won't rise up because they're afraid the Confederate Army will leave and they won't be able to protect them. That's when Lee makes the decision. Well, okay, we need to accelerate the military planning for this. And also, he learns that McClellan's army is moving toward him, and he thinks, well, let's pull them into Washington County. So that's why they go west. Because some people say, well, why didn't they just march on Baltimore? Well, it's because Lee wanted to pull them far away from their line of supply as possible. He wanted to pull them over two mountain ranges so that there would be no second Manassas again, because he had seen that army disintegrate in front of his troops and run back to the safety of the Washington fortifications. And so he's got second Manassas in his mind, I think, when he's making this plan for
Sure.
what ends up happening at Sharpsburg.
I like that. So that brings up my big one. I wanted to talk to you about Special Orders 191.
Yeah, sure, please.
So I read recently from are you familiar with Stottlemyre's McClellan book?
Yeah, yeah, sure.
Have you? And
Yeah,
he does a
I have it. Yeah.
191. You do? Okay, cool. So
Mhm.
I'm sure you're familiar with the 191 piece in that.
Yeah.
And your 191 piece is phenomenal. Do you want to talk about what made you want to write more about 191? I mean, other than it being from the Confederate perspective this time, which is, I think, pretty interesting too. And like, what did that really do for the Confederate Army as a whole there? Like, did that, Lee doesn't discover, first of all, that McClellan had this until post-war, right?
So,
Or-
all right, there's a couple questions there. Let's take the first one. The
yeah.
first one is why I decided to write about it, and the fact is that the evidence led me to decide to write about it. I actually had no intention of writing about Special Orders on number 191 because I didn't think anything else needed to be said about it. But I also didn't think that there was anything new that I had found in my research. And but then I realized that hold on a second. I'm not finding D.H. Hill's men camping anywhere near where those orders were lost. And so that's when I started to look into it even more. And I thought, I go where the evidence takes me. That's,
Yeah.
I'm an historian. So the evidence took me to that. And I realized that, okay, the only evidence I have is that D.H. Hill's headquarters was either at a place called the George Markell Farm, which
Hmm.
is actually about a mile southeast or southwest of Lee's headquarters. So Special Orders 191 are found about 2 miles, 3 miles north about a mile north of Lee's headquarters, northeast of
Okay.
Lee's
Hmm.
headquarters. So completely opposite direction. Or in Frederick proper, which is not where they were found.
No.
And then his command, the only thing that evidence that I found was that Hill's entire division camped, with the exception of Roswell Ripley's brigade, camped along Ballinger Creek, which is again southwest of Frederick. So, or of Lee's headquarters, where he was. So, in other words, if a courier was sent to take the orders to D.H. Hill, that guy must have been drunk, or he must have been he got completely turned around and had no idea where he was, because he went in the opposite direction of where Hill
Sure.
was. So the evidence doesn't show that Hill was in that area. And then I started to look at the Union sources, and I'm like, well, is there any evidence that this was a Confederate encampment? I mean, did someone camp there? And I could find no evidence of any kind of nothing. I mean, all of the federal troops that go through the area, they mention clean grass and fields of wheat and locust trees and bushes and things like that. Nobody says anything about what you would find if tens of thousands of men had camped in a field, right?
Right.
For several days. You'd find carcasses, you'd find old equipment, you'd find newspapers and fire pits and garbage and broken bottles and ammunition. You'd find all the stuff that an army brings with it, right? None of that. There's no evidence for any of that. So I realized that for all these years, people have been arguing that the orders were found on D.H. Hill's D.H. Hill's campsite when they couldn't have been. And then I started to think, well, and then I started to look into where the other orders had gone. So there were something like 11 copies made to all the major generals, and then one for the records, and one for Jefferson Davis, and all these things. And I realized that we know all of them had been delivered, all of them. So if all of them had been delivered and no one was camped at that place, that means that there's an outlier there.
Yeah.
So if it's an outlier, why would there be an outlier in that direction? And that's when I found out. I compared the two. There are two maps of Frederick County that show, one of them is after the war and one of them is before the war. And so the one before the war shows that this man named Elias de Lashboot, he was renting or owned the farm near where the orders were found.
Okay.
And after the war, totally different name, different person. Something F. Myers, I think, is the person who owns it, or the family or farmer who owns it at that point in time, or rents it. It might be a rented property. So I realized that Delashmoot is related to Arthur Delashmoot, who is a well-known Confederate sympathizer who actually rides out of the city to meet Jackson's troops as they're coming up the road from Washington, right? That direction of Washington, Georgetown Pike. And so it dawned on me. I'm like, well, there's this guy's a Confederate sympathizer, or potentially a Confederate sympathizer. I couldn't find any evidence that he specifically was, but he comes from a family of known sympathizers in the region. And then I realized that all the other evidence that I had found, that Confederate officers were staying with families of Confederate sympathizers, either in Frederick or in the vicinity. And so so once I put those two pieces together, the fact that the orders were an outlier, they went someplace that they shouldn't have gone there's no reason why they should have gone in that direction. So that means somebody off the radar carried them, right? And it wasn't a courier, because there's no reason for a courier to deliver them in that direction. So someone off the radar carried them, and it was found on the farm of a family of known Confederate sympathizers. So that means it must have been a Confederate officer. Who is the only other Confederate officer who is mentioned whose command is mentioned in the orders, and who was at Lee's headquarters on the 8th of September when the orders were first being developed? That's another one of those things that others will argue that that's completely wrong. But if you look at the argument, or if you look at the document itself, there's an 8 that's scratched out, and then a 9 written in there. So they were being developed on the 8th. And so I realized that the section that Mark mentions D.H. Hill's command also mentions the reserve artillery. And so William Nelson Pendleton was in the area. He said that he was visiting Lee's headquarters on the 8th, and that Lee knows well what he's about. He said he won't write that. He writes to his wife, Lee knows well what he's about. He shared his plans with him. So he knew what the plans were.
Sure.
Um, and so, and then he said, after I was in Lee's headquarters, I went to visit friends in Frederick, which is the
Mhm.
direction that the orders went. So it occurred to me that William Nelson Pendleton is a likely candidate for the one who lost these orders. And he may have lost them because in the 2 weeks before the Maryland campaign, he had suffered terribly from malaria and
Mhm.
and malaria causes terrible diarrhea. And so he was sick. And then he had recovered well enough to follow the army into Maryland. He follows the army into Maryland, and then a captain from his command kind of criticizes Pendleton and says that he's sick again. You know, he argues that he's actually lying, but I don't know if he's lying. I
Mm.
think that he actually may have had another bout of malaria or flare up of malaria. I mean, he's an old man by this time, obviously,
Yeah.
for the time, you know. It occurred to me that, well, if Lee gave a copy of, or Chilton gave a copy of the
Mhm.
orders to Pendleton on the 8th, because they're not complete. Remember, there are two sections missing from the top of them,
Mhm.
um, and they're not complete. So what if Pendleton took those orders and then as he was riding back to Delashmoot's farm to drop them off at his quarters because he
Mhm.
didn't want to carry them around with him, and then
Yeah.
he had about a diarrhea and had to run to a bush or something, throw off his frock coat. The
There
orders
goes the
fall on the
orders.
ground, and
Yeah.
that's why they're there.
And it supposedly wrapped around two cigars too. That could have made, I mean, were those you probably gifts to Pendleton, or maybe just a way of keeping the orders
Maybe
undetected. We don't know.
maybe he had them in his pot, and maybe he wrapped them for some reason. Who
Yeah.
knows?
No,
This is one of the things that I couldn't find out, and this is one of those little things. Like I said, you pull a thread, and then
Mm-hmm.
you come to the end, and you're like, well, what? There must be more of this. I couldn't find out if the Lashmoot, or not Lashmoot, excuse me, if Pendleton smoked. I
Yeah,
asked
I was gonna say I don't even know if
I
he
still
smoked.
haven't found
Yeah.
that out. So I did that for D.H. Hill too,
Hmm.
and eventually found two really interesting pieces of evidence. One is that he smoked a short pipe. So he smoked a pipe, not cigars. Pipe
Right.
smokers don't tend not to smoke cigars,
Right.
and cigar smokers tend not to smoke pipes. Now it's wartime, and if you have tobacco of any kind, then maybe
Filter.
you'll
Yeah.
smoke it, right? So but and then also he wrote an article after the war in his Land We Love
Hmm.
journal. So Hill said that he actually criticized people who smoke tobacco as like a character flaw.
Oh.
So that struck me as well. These definitely can go to down to DHL with wrapped around cigars, because he didn't smoke them. I can't find any evidence he smoked them.
Yeah, and that's even stronger evidence to say why would Hill have lost orders at two cigars, other than just maybe discarding because it
Yeah.
was cigars, But that makes so much sense if he's not
Hmm.
smoking and we couldn't find any evidence at all. Like,
Hmm.
why is this guy the one carrying it? The Pendleton one I thought was really interesting too, and I appreciate Doug Ashton for also coming in with a comment. He was asking you to elaborate on that, so I appreciate your hypothesis on that. That's really really cool,
Yeah.
and it changes how I view 191 completely. Because I was looking at it too from Stoudemire's sake. I think he did a really good job trying to give McClellan a better shake than most of us have ever given McClellan. It's McClellan, so he's like one of our favorite generals to hate, if that makes any sense. Next to Henry
It makes
Halleck,
sense.
yeah, I'm a huge Henry Halleck and me do not no.
Yeah,
I,
I agree with you. Although it
uh,
could be argued that the fact that he ordered, or he left Dixon Miles' command sitting there at Harper's Ferry, actually ruined the campaign for Lee. So, it's ironic.
I never thought about it that way either.
Well, think about it. There wouldn't have been any Special Orders 191.
There wouldn't have been. Thank you, Halleck. I guess there's something I could thank him for. That's really good.
Now,
Yeah.
I have another book coming out this year, and that's called The
Oh,
Tale Untwisted, and that looks at the special orders from the Union side. So you'll get a chance
ooh.
to see that in more depth.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm excited. And that's coming out this year?
This year, yeah, it should be May, June timeframe.
Awesome. Is
It's
that
in
from Savage
production right
Beatty as
now.
well?
Yep, Samus Beatty.
Yes. Okay, cool.
It's an expansion of an essay that I did with a man named Gene Thorpe, who's a wonderful cartographer. He did the maps for my book.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
Gene has been researching this question for decades, actually, and So we decided to write it together because Gene's very short on time.
Mhm.
I have some time, but I didn't have the sources as well as much detail that he had. So I used the material I had, combined it with what he had, and we came up with this book called The Tale Untwisted, which originally an essay for part of the Savage Beatty Spotlight series,
Mhm.
and we decided to expand it. So it's going to be, I think the manuscript's like 200 pages long right now. And it's got 16 maps and appendices and things like that. So you'll learn a lot. You'll learn a lot about why the Noon theory, the Noon trophies telegram theory, is just absolute bunk.
I like to hear that, man. Like I said, and we're approaching the 160th of Antietam too, so this is a
Mhm.
perfect time to just be
Yeah,
putting content out on that.
it
So
is.
that's going to
Yeah.
be awesome. I always look for a good book to have in my hand while I'm on the battlefield because I feel like a lot of these can be great to read on the spots too. So if even just bringing something like that up, and then my next trip up to Maryland,
Yeah, sure.
it's going to be nice to have. So that's really exciting to see, and I really hope to be able to read Guns of September sometime soon because I'm that coming off of reading 6 Days of September. Actually, I'm planning to reread that soon because I need to get another novel in, and I'm just like I enjoy that story was just such an adventure, and I want to get back into that again. So
Yeah, that was a real interesting book to research too,
I can
because
imagine.
I mean, finding some of the local connections to Lee's army, and finding that there was a Confederate officer actually buried in the same cemetery as my grandmother-in-law,
Oh wow.
is my wife's family, is just was kind of eye-opening. I had no idea because there's nothing on his obelisk that says he was a Confederate officer.
Bob Smart. If Halleck hadn't forced HF to stay occupied, there wouldn't have been the need to have a division stay at Harper's Ferry to parole the prisoners and be late to get to Sharpsburg. So Halleck won the battle.
Typical Bob, very provocative.
And Shane Andrew comes in as well. Thanks for doing this tonight. The My Maryland book was the best book on the Maryland campaign that I've ever read.
Thanks, Shane. I
Yeah,
appreciate
that's
it.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
By the way,
No,
does everyone know that My Maryland was actually set to the music of O Tannenbaum?
I have to admit, that just came to me this year. And I was thinking of course, Oh Christmas Tree. I'm like,
Yeah, right, right.
oh my gosh, like what are the
Maryland, my
I,
Maryland.
yeah,
Da, da,
it's
da,
like,
da, da, da.
it was awesome the revelation that, and I'm just like, so I don't look at it as a Christmas song anymore. And there's a game that I play, that War of Rights game, that really focuses on the Maryland campaign. And it was funny because this year for the Christmas little theme that they put up, they had a bunch of the soldiers wearing, instead of kepis, Santa hats, which was for us like, okay, that's
Mhm.
kind of funny. But they were using the Maryland song instead as
Yeah,
their
okay.
Christmas song. I was like, I love that. Like these guys know something at least.
Yeah, right.
So that was cool. But no, and again, that was a really cool way, I think, to start the book, to draw somebody in, is to have that, the story behind that essay was awesome. And I'm a musician myself. I used to play, but not anything great, but I'm a bassist. So like I played a little bit, and I do enjoy history of music every now and again. And that really was awesome to read.
Yeah,
So
thanks.
and again, if you don't have the book already, I can't stress enough how great this is. So definitely try to pick up a copy. And you have it on Amazon as well, if it's not on the Savage Speedy site.
It's on the Savage Beatty website. Go ahead and get it there. Don't
Yeah.
go on Amazon. Let's
Thank you.
not support big tech.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm with you, man. That's was able to get mine from Savage Speedy too, which is a great place to get it from. Most of anything they come out with, I try to get it through their actual website.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a great website, and they often have, if you wait long enough, they always have these free media ship
I love
codes,
those.
and
Love those.
so you don't have to pay any shipping for them anyway.
Yeah. No, yes, he's right. Go to Savage Speedy to get anything published by SB. Definitely go there before Amazon's like last resort if you're trying to get a book,
Yep,
especially if SB has it.
use it for rare stuff.
Yeah, sometimes I found like one or two things on there, but I've found that I have only ordered their. Well, of course, I had to get something from the UK. I'm doing some Titanic research right now, and the book is somehow cheaper on Amazon. It's 163 for the 2 volume set, and yeah, it's still steep. I'm finding it for like $400 on like thrift books. I'm like, you're supposed to be thrift books for, and I get it, but those are used too.
Yeah,
So I'm like, holy crap, I'll
it's
get a
like,
new copy. But here's the other problem. It came somewhat damaged from Amazon because it was coming from
uh,
Australia. So it's a slipcase. So I'm much happier that it was just the slipcase that took a little bit of some damage. But still, when you're paying upwards of $170 for a 2 volume set, you want those things to be like pristine. And
yeah, you do.
so I'm grateful on that.
Definitely.
Bob Smart said, I love the chapter about the Confederate shopping spree in Frederick. The book fills a major gap in the story on the campaign.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I wanted to write that. I had so many anecdotes about things that they experienced and the interaction with people and stuff like that. It was too much. I couldn't not put that in there. And
Sure.
it's funny because Doug Ashton said the same thing to me. He said, I always leave him every time to read something I leave him with an image that it sticks in his mind, and the one for him was Confederate soldiers standing on the street corners and things in groups in Frederick, eating watermelon and throwing the rinds in the pits and spinning the pits everywhere. And so there would be this watermelon rinds covering the street. It's just I thought that was really nice of him to put to put that way.
Kinds of watermelon. I mean, I can't imagine just some of the stuff they came off with, with their little shopping spree that you were saying. So it's cool that we have some
I mean, they
touching on
grabbed
that.
everything. They got caviar and ice cream and champagne and what they called well they call it's funny they call potatoes Irish potatoes. So I think they're the little yellow ones,
Yeah,
those things. So Irish potatoes, sardines, I mean, you name it, they ate it.
they had. Yeah, you name it, they ate it. I like that. And I've read of a recent book. Earl Hess wrote something on feeding the armies. It was really interesting to read. So I found that the logistics behind that kind of interesting. And then to see in your book about just again the shopping spree of the things and the foodstuffs that were offered when you occupy a town like that.
Yeah,
Caviar still that I almost wanted to backtrack to. I'm like, they had caviar in Frederick, Maryland at that time.
yeah,
No
mhm,
kidding. I
yeah.
wouldn't have I wouldn't have thought that to be on the
A lot of
menu
rich
there.
people, a lot of very rich town.
Was that a predominantly rich town, or was it just
Oh, the
happened to
wealth
happen?
in the area from, well, and also the proximity to Washington and
Yeah,
the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I mean, if you have all
sure.
those things, you could get whatever shipped from Baltimore, you can get shipped in. I mean, the Baltimore Ohio Railroad is what made one of the most famous whiskeys in the area at the time. You like rye whiskey, I know. So
Yeah, oh yeah.
here's a rye whiskey story for you.
Mhm. Oh
My
yes.
wife's my wife's family, her family name is Ahalt, and they come
Okay.
from the Middletown Valley. And there used to be an Ahalt distillery that made world famous rye whiskey. And the way that they made it is that they would, of course, distill the whiskey, put it in barrels, and then they would send it to Baltimore, put it
Hmm.
on a ship, and then the ship would carry the whiskey down in its hold, the barrels of whiskey, to San Francisco. And on the trip, now remember, no Panama Canal this time, so they had to go
Yeah, they're doing
South
the whole.
America, long, long trip. And by the time it came back to Maryland, it had taken on a briny, salty kind of a taste. So it was rye whiskey that had a taste of seawater. And it made it very unique. And their whiskey was really really popular and very famous until Prohibition, ruined their whiskey
Oh
business.
man, I was gonna say, is there even a remote recipe running around nowadays? No.
I can tell you where the ruins are of the distillery, but I don't know of any bottles. I haven't seen any bottles.
Wow, but you know where the ruins are too,
You
and
know where the
that's in.
ruins are. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that would be one hell of an episode for the Unfiltered Historian if you ever wanted to go out and do the talk about that. That's because I love rye whiskey and stuff like that, but I do find there's a lot of interesting stories to mix, with history. And have you read Muskets and Applejack by chance?
I have not read that. No. Mm-mm.
I highly recommend if you would ever want to read it. It's the history of alcohol in the Civil War, and there's some really interesting stuff in there. And the guy
Yeah,
wrote
just the
Mint
terms
Juleps with
alone would
Teddy.
probably be interesting.
Oh yeah, there's some accounts of men pouring whiskey in their muzzles and forgetting that they've loaded it recently, and so they'll turn the gun up to take a swig, and in comes black powder too, and it's
Yeah,
just
like saltpeter and whiskey. Ugh.
yeah. But and I love how the guy broke it down too, because he said, he went and started documenting some Confederate. Then, of course, the initial story out at Shiloh is that there is this instance of that happening where they're doing this on purpose. I don't believe it was on purpose, and neither does the author. He supports this that the Union soldiers found the corpses and their eyes were completely blackened,
Hmm.
and that they were fighting with some tenacity they haven't seen before, and they were attributing it to them taking shots out of their muskets.
Hmm.
Whether they were doing it on purpose like that, like I like to think that somebody didn't just pour some black powder into some whiskey and then shoot it back. I mean, that's tempting fate there.
Yeah, sure.
But I do believe somebody may have forgotten they're carrying around their loaded weapon and went to swig it, and here's a mini ball with some black powder all in
I
the
could see
whiskey.
that happening.
Yeah,
It's
like,
still
oh
the
god.
lead too.
Yeah. But yeah, that would be interesting, man. I'd never really even touched the surface on talking about stuff like that, because that's a huge part of the history behind Maryland as well. Like, that's somebody's livelihood. That was somebody's way of making a living, and
Yeah.
very interesting one at that. Putting it on ships and sailing it all the way to San Francisco.
Yeah. I don't know how they discovered it, but that's the story that I read.
Oh my gosh, that is interesting. Well, as we're nearing our end here, do you have anything you'd like to talk about on your end? You have as much time as you want to. I'm just hours normally, but I like to give folks. But if you have anything you'd like to speak on, wait,
Mm.
muskets and out. Yep, thank you for. It's on Amazon here. It looks like Bob gave us a link for
Oh,
it if
okay,
anyone's
great. Thanks,
interested.
Bob.
So I appreciate that, Bob. Yeah, that book right there is fantastic, and it's comical too. But it also goes and does some justice by dispelling a lot of the "was he drunk at Chancellorsville?" We all know who we're talking about when I say that.
Yeah.
But they do a lot of
You mean
good.
Shanks Evans?
Yes, shakes.
He used to carry around a barrelito on the back of his horse.
Oh my gosh. In the Kindle version. Perfect. I didn't even know there was a Kindle version. So great. I might have to get another copy of that. Man, it was awesome. So yeah, if there's any I have Doug Ashton here with comments. So my personal Facebook, where this is aired sometimes, doesn't like to give me the comments on here, so I have to go and copy and paste. So sorry about that wait there, but I like Doug Ashton. Please comment on the watermelon rides and seeds. We did talk about that one.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
awesome.
talked
Okay,
about this. Yeah.
cool. So that comment is there, and he put one more. Let me go see what he said real quick. He's Stonewall Jackson's famished men gorged on oysters and canned lobster captured at Manassas from the Federals. Canned lobster?
Yeah, yeah, they tins of lobster and all kinds of stuff. There are photographs of the train, what it looked like after Jackson's men had finished plundering it.
Probably nothing. Skeletal remains of a train at that point.
Yeah, not much.
But yeah, no, please. Do you have anything you'd like to add, or anything more so from
Yeah,
your end?
sure. So,
Awesome.
I have a couple of well, I have an essay coming out in North and South
Oh,
next
cool.
month. And actually, they're going to use the colorized version of the Wode drawing in my book of
Oh,
on my for my
awesome.
book too, for the cover of the magazine too. I was really honored by that. I mean, that's incredible. But one of the things that it does is it ties together a thread that I started exploring in there, Maryland, but I didn't actually put together until right after I finished the book. Which is unfortunate because I tease it, but I don't actually get into it, specifically get into it. And that is that Robert E. Lee intended to draw McClellan into Washington County, right? So we
Hmm.
all know about that, and we intended to draw him into a fight there, and he intended to have that fight at a place called Beaver Creek. And there is a series of heights behind Beaver Creek. You can drive. There's a road that runs all along the heights down in the front, but there are a lot of houses on it, unfortunately, so you can't really walk the grounds. But it's definitely a place that people should go in order to see where Lee. So you're talking about what ifs, right?
Right.
This is what if Special Orders 191 had not been lost. Where would the fight have taken place? It wouldn't have been at Sharpsburg. It would have been
Hmm.
in this position at Beaver Creek. It's 5 miles northwest of Boonesboro,
Okay.
and Lee intended to draw McClellan's army toward, over Catoxins and the middle into the Middletown Valley, up to South Mountain, and then when Harper's Ferry fell, which he had anticipated happening no later than the 14th of September, that he would then pull D.H. Hill's command back from Boonesboro
Hmm.
and have Jackson and all the rest of them march to meet Longstreet's command at Beaver Creek, and that's where the fight would have taken place. So
No kidding.
Robert E. Lee's orders going astray, and McClellan moving faster than Lee found convenient, wrecked that plan for Lee. So Lee had set a trap for him. And the really interesting thing about Beaver Creek is that it stretches from Antietam Creek in the west, or the heights behind Beaver Creek. They stretch from Antietam Creek in the west all the way to South Mountain. So there's almost no way to flank the position. So McClellan would have been forced to try and turn it somehow. I don't exactly know how,
Hmm.
or to it simply would have been Fredericksburg in Maryland, right? And that's what Lee had hoped, that he would have what ends up becoming Fredericksburg in Maryland.
Hmm.
But that plan gets ruined by McClellan moving too fast. So Lee is forced to return Longstreet's command to South Mountain, as we know, and then tries to hold the gaps there because Harper's Ferry hasn't fallen. It survives one more day longer than Lee had expected it to. And he says this: he had hoped that Jackson would be finished had finished operation by the 14th, and that they could have met up. And so when he falls back toward Virginia, and then ends up deciding to take position at Sharpsburg, what he finds there, and one of the reasons I think that Lee doesn't say this, but it's easy to infer from what he does, is that the position at Sharpsburg is their heights right behind a
Hmm.
watercourse. That's exactly what the Beaver Creek position was. It was heights behind a watercourse. And so Lee looks for the same terrain that he found earlier to execute his plan, and decides that he's going to try and fight there, as opposed to Beaver Creek, which was ruined. Um, the problem is that McClellan's army moving faster than Lee had expected also creates knock-on problems for Lee's army. So
Hmm.
he needs to, everybody needs to be these forced marches, right? Jackson has to make a forced march from Harper's Ferry. McLaws and Anderson have to make a forced march from
Yeah.
Harper's Ferry. A.P. Hill has to make a forced march from Harper's Ferry. If you have an army that's already breaking down because your guys have no shoes, or many of them have no shoes, and they have very little in the way of rations, I would say that probably half of Lee's army melts away because of straggling that takes place during these forced marches. And so imagine if so McClellan's moving faster than Lee expected him to. Actually,
Hmm.
gives McClellan a better place to fight than he would have had. It gives Lee a worse place to fight than he would have had because he wasn't ready for it. It also provides an open left flank that McClellan can take advantage of, that Lee had no interest in actually having. He wanted to have his left flank anchored on that Beaver Creek position, and it reduces the number of Confederate troops that make it to the field. So you can see that the argument about whether or not special orders number 191, whether the discovery of them was important or not. You'll have people dismiss it, say, well, the information was 4 days old.
Hmm.
It didn't help McClellan fight at Antietam, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue it did help McClellan fight at Antietam significantly, because it reduced the size of the enemy's army, and it reduced Lee's chances to win that fight. Those are things that I tease and I anticipate in their Maryland, and you can
Hmm.
infer them from what's in there. It's just that I didn't tie that knot until afterward, and that's what's coming out in the North and South article.
Sweet. Well, I'll make sure to be on the lookout for that, man. That's going to be fun. Bob Smart says Beaver Creek sounds like a Vorbach lecture.
Yeah, I guess it could be. Someone needs to
Yeah.
invite me.
Yeah. Well, and when your north, if you want to come in and elaborate more, we can set something up for when your north south article comes out. Or I would love to continue talking to you about Antietam too, because I need someone here that knows their stuff. You've just been bringing a wealth
Sure.
of stuff out there. So yeah, if you want to, at any time, there's an invite to come back on and join them. Hopefully, technology and traffic holds out enough to where we can actually make these
Yeah,
things happen. Because I'm
absolutely.
sure you know how the area is here with traffic. That
Oh, your area is terrible. I couldn't
oh
live in
my
the
gosh,
Sharpsburg area. I had to drive through there in December when I came back from my parents for Christmas, and and that was before the snow ended up clogging up
hmm.
the road. And that place is
Oh
just
man,
awful. I wish it wasn't the way I remember how it used to be 25 years ago. It was crowded, but it was
yeah.
nothing like it is now.
And they're trying to build, I don't know if you've seen, and I was talking to Chris Bryan about this a little bit, they're trying to build a 44,000 square unit complex in the wilderness.
Oh my God, another one.
Another one.
So is the American Battlefield Trust on this?
Yeah, they have. There's a lot of people on it, and there's a website proposing it. And if you look at the map, it's a monstrosity. Number one,
Mm,
it's terrifying too, because what we're thinking about too, and speaking about traffic, is I see the
volume of people.
Stonehouse Manassas, that intersection right there, on
Hmm.
a 5 o'clock on a Monday or a
Oh
Tuesday.
yeah, it's just
It's
constant
hell.
traffic going out. Yep.
Hmm. That's going to be Route 20 and Route 3.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
Route 3 is already crap. Like, we don't we don't need that to be any worse. But
Yeah.
yeah, that's again, when we get, especially when your book comes out too later this year, I'm definitely going to want to make sure I have a copy of that, read through that, and have you back on to talk about that one. So we
Thanks,
can
either me or
continue.
Gene Thorpe, because Gene is just, I mean, if you think I know a lot, you should, that guy is
We,
unbelievable.
if you both want to do it, we can. So I can put more than one screen up here, so we can do a joint
Actually,
thing where he comes on and we talk it out. Because yeah, you provided some of the greatest content I think I've had on this show before, and I love it. So
no, thanks. I appreciate
yeah,
it.
absolutely,
I'll
man.
give you
Well,
one more little tidbit.
yeah, please do.
So on the morning of September 14th, Robert E. Lee didn't leave the Hagerstown with Longstreet's command until between 9 and 11 o'clock a.m. So not at daylight.
Really?
Not at
No.
daylight. He didn't leave right away. There's more than enough evidence to show that. So that's all. That's a lie that he told, and he told it repeatedly. And Longstreet also told it as well.
I wonder what the motive for that was.
Well, that's another good question, isn't it?
Yeah, because both of them are in on it. There's got to be some underlying factor behind that.
Mm-hmm.
Bob Smart said, "As we need, then it's going to be both." Then
Great.
you've
Well,
spoken.
yeah,
I'm excited. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, again, if you don't have anything else, I guess we can go ahead and wrap up. This was a very successful one. I will do some edits over the next few hours and get this put up on Spotify.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
great.
So
We're on
if
Spotify.
anyone listens there,
We're not going to get canceled, are we? Because we're talking about Confederate history.
oh, I hope not. As long as Neil Young's not listening,
Yeah, right. Here's.
Did you hear Barry Manilow got kicked or got himself off too?
No, that was he tweeted that was a rumor. He was not doing that.
Okay. So, you know what? Barry Manilow's music's pretty cool.
So to make sure that we do check the box, for
Yeah.
being okay on Spotify. There's one thing I would like to mention too is
Sure.
that women played an incredible role defining the experience for Confederate troops. They were almost always right about whether women were friendly or whether they were hostile. And it seems to me that the balance was that most of the women were hostile, and they were so nasty to Confederate troops. They would hold their nose as they walked, as they marched past. They
Oh
would
my
they would make them see gestures. They would cuss at them. They would
Wow.
there were some of these like interactions between them where rebel troops would go to a house and say, "Can we have some water?" And so a woman will say, "Well, I'd rather poison you than give you water," or I'd give my milk to the hogs first and stuff. I mean, just terrible stuff that they would say to them. So I think that the role of women has been overlooked, and I think is an area of study that if there's anyone listening who knows anyone who's looking for a research topic for especially like a PhD or a master's thesis, the role of women in the Maryland campaign and helping to define the experience, that's totally uncharted territory and is really worth investigating.
That. Oh, whoa. That is something I didn't, and I'm not considering it out of any purpose or anything, but I never even really considered how strong of an impact that would have.
I
That's
didn't
a hell
realize,
of a, yeah.
I didn't realize it either until I was reading all these accounts, and it was always about women were waving their handkerchiefs at us, or and they were waving little flags at us, or there were women who were doing all the things I was saying, about the obscene gestures and
Yeah.
stuff like
So
that.
my morale would plummet if a woman just decided to do that to me while I'm on the
Yeah,
side
right.
of the road. Like, no, not cool. Wow, that's interesting. Again, I appreciate everything tonight, and I hope everything goes well for you the rest of this week, even though we are now working towards Friday, which is
Yeah,
awesome. Get
good.
some more rye whiskey in tomorrow night since it's
Yep.
Friday.
Yeah.
All right,
Well,
Alex.
good
Well,
luck
thank
to
you
you.
so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, my friend. Have a good night.
Okay, thanks. Take care.
Take care.